All right, Shano. So we're going to talk a bit about the push-ups. Yeah, we got to looking, putting out the vibes, looking cash, putting out the vibes.
Notice that we're down at the bar.
Yeah, down at the bar, putting out the vibes. Yeah, nudge. All right, so let's talk about the push-up. So here's a concept. A lot of people will poo-poo the push-up because they feel like it's not an advanced exercise, especially for people who have been training for a long time. And I think that they're doing themselves a massive disservice by not putting push-ups in their programs at least a few times a year or as a supplementary exercise at some point. The push-up works the scapula and the glenohumeral joint through proper ranges of motion like protraction, retraction. It also does things like controlling anterior and pelvic tilt of the scapula. And realistically, if all people are doing are things like bench press, back supported overhead press and things like that, the scapula have no reason to provide stability. So I found this out the hard way a few years ago. I was in Chicago at Zach Trowbridge's gym, and I was benching 165 kilos. To make sure that people know that wasn't pounds, because that would be a really weak amount. But 165 kilos for sets of 5 to 6, and I thought, you know what? I haven't done push-ups in a long time. I'm gonna try to do some push-ups. I got on the ground and I could barely do 10 push-ups at a slow, like 401 or 402 tempo. And I looked at Zoe and I went, this is ridiculous. I would actually rather load 365 pounds on the bench and rep that out and then unload it than do push-ups, because the push-ups are actually harder for me to do than the bench press.
I think that's where we think about regressions, right? As we think, how do you progress a bodyweight movement? And I think a lot of people think in that terms of, for example, a bodyweight squat. You do so many bodyweight squats, the natural next progression is to add load. You need to add some type of exogenous load to that, which is going to be in the form of a dumbbell, barbell, whatever that may be, or moving onto a machine. It's very similar in regards to a push-up, is that we go from, can your client do a push-up? And if they can't, we either immediately put them on a bench and we just teach them how to do something that is now artificially increase the level of stability rather than working on or addressing the areas of weakness. And very similarly with a push-up, it's like, okay, now I can do 10 reps or 12 reps or whatever it may be. I'm just going to move them onto loading something, because push-ups now become easy. And exactly as you mentioned there as well, we lose sight of the fact that, are you doing push-ups or are you doing strict tempo push-ups, and also full range. There was a challenge that kind of went out through the COVID time, and it was people doing push-up challenges. And I saw a lot of different push-ups of quarter reps, half reps, incomplete range, and they're kind of like these pulses at the bottom, and we consider those reps. And I think that's where a lot of people then lose sight of what you mentioned before, is that full scapular protraction. And that would be the part that I would emphasize the most, because for a lot of people, getting down is not necessarily the problem. Getting back up and then actually emphasizing that full protraction at the top while maintaining good complete body posture, that's where a lot of people fall apart.
Yeah, I think too, if you look at how the scapula are moving in this, the retraction portion isn't really that difficult. When you have the retraction, you've got some downward rotation, but then when you go into protraction, you need upward rotation. Now you start having an issue. And if you don't balance those two movements are inherently antagonistic to each other. So a lot of people will have issues, they go to doing overhead presses, they have poor flexion, they have a lot of internal rotation, they have a lot of thoracolumbar issues because they're overhead pressing and leaning back. Because they have poor shoulder function. If more people would work their scapula through a complete range of motion by using things like protracted or retracted push-ups, and also things like rows, especially things like TRX rows or seated cable rows, I think we would see a lot less shoulder injuries in our industry.
I think when we think about that as well in regards to exactly what you just mentioned in terms of the shoulder function. Trying to take that, so for example, if you're on a bench, if you're going down into a full stretch at the bottom, you're now able to increase that range by taking the elbow beyond the actual level of the bench. Similarly, when we're in a push-up, we obviously can't take our body through the floor, so elevating the hands on either side, I'm a big fan of stretch push-ups, just purely because in the opening phases, taking someone through a GPP, is that when we're prepping their body to be able to actually access strength in a full range when you're giving dumbbells or a barbell, I want them to be able to already do that with a push-up. Mm-hmm. And if you can do 10 to 12 reps with a pause and holding the bottom, and your hands are now at floor level, but you're able to take your chest beyond that level, is that you're going to be able to access a lot more strength through that range, rather than having to stay kind of just in this range of going, yeah, but that doesn't feel good on my shoulder, or this feels too tight through my pecs.
I think too, like with all the fascial stretch therapy and other therapies we do at our facility, the main instigators in poor shoulder health that I see is really weak lower traps, rhomboids, and serratus anterior. And the serratus anterior is a big deal because if they don't keep the serratus anterior activated, then the scapula tend to wing out. So one of the first things I do as an assessment, I see if I can slide my hand under someone's scapula, and when I see a lot of internal rotation and people, I've had a number of guys come to me lately because they're embarrassed to take their shirt off because they're in this posture and their chest doesn't look nice and they can't feel their chest when they actually go to bench press. So I asked them, well, how many push-ups do you do? They go, well, I don't do push-ups, that's a sissy boy exercise. I'm like, okay, how much exercise do you do for those little muscles in the upper back? Oh, I do a lot of rowing and pull-ups and pull-downs. That stuff's not really gonna address that stuff like we need to. So I think the push-up in that full range where we're going into retraction and also going to protraction takes care of a lot of the stuff that we're not thinking about, because a lot of people only think about working those muscles through rowing and pull-downs.
Yeah, I think, and that's been proven to us as well, especially in light of recent events with COVID. Obviously, people that we're training now are starting to get access to gyms, but for a lot of our clients who went through those home workout-based situations where I say regressed because we regressed them to some form of body weight. We weren't loading movements, but we regressed them into a whole new realm of movement where they actually learned to move their body in a new way that they've not done before, and also testing ranges of strength that have not yet been tested.
And actually in ranges that are more natural to the body anyways,
yeah.
Right? Like there's nothing inherently natural about a bench press or a squat. Once we start getting them doing things like pistols and single leg squats and shrimp squats and push-ups and that type of thing, they start to figure out really fast, oh man, I'm really strong at these really big exercises, but I'm actually really weak at normal human movement. And then now they start to come to a realization of no wonder I have so many niggles. My body actually only works well when I'm under load on a bench and in a stable position. So what are the common faults that we see with people's push-ups, and how do we progress them through?
So for me personally, I find working more online now is that, like, whenever I ask someone to do a push-up, the common things I'll see is that if it's a push-up and it's a strict push-up with feet on the floor, hands on the floor, is that usually there's some form of torso or abdominal collapse. So usually through learning to brace from the feet all the way to the hands in terms of being a point of contact, there's usually some form of collapse there. So usually they reach the floor, then as they go to press, there's a overextension of the back to try and drive the floor away, but the legs aren't actually moving away from the floor. So in terms of keeping strict posture, if you will, is that they can't actually press without hyperextending the back to try and push the floor up. So we almost end up in like a cobra position at the top. I'm not sure.
The worm push-up. You ever seen the worm dance? Maybe we'll slide in a clip of somebody doing the worm to show people. That's what it looks like. It's like you've got the upper body strength to actually push off the floor, but you don't have the strength in the core area to actually keep your hips stable, and then you start dragging your hips up with you, which can cause issues with the lower back. And realistically, if we don't take care of that stuff, you're never going to get better. So in some cases, I know you like to start with knees on, like push-ups on knees, which I like because then that disassociates the need for that core strength with the push-ups. But we can't just go from there to a regular push-up or an elevated push-up because we still haven't addressed the issue of the core. So I think it's important for people to understand that if you want to break this into multiple movements, you have to do that and link them together. So we might use things like hollow holds, we might use things like planks on a Smith machine or an elevated bar so that they can learn how to keep that posterior pelvic tilt and keep everything pulled up and in so that they can keep the ribs attached to the hips, because that's normally what I see the issue is, that they have a disassociation between keeping the hips stable with the ribs. So once they start to push up, that all unlocks and then they start sagging. So what would be your suggestions on that, starting with knees, push-ups on knees, and then...
So the push-ups on knees for me, just so I can clarify on that, is that, like you mentioned before, it's the same of any other movement. If you can't do a squat, repeatedly going in and loading a squat or putting a barbell on the back or whatever that may be, and doing that same movement is not necessarily going to correct it. We may need to regress and go to things like split squats and actually teach the body, like if you're not going to be balanced and strong on 2 legs, why do you think that balanced and strong on 1 leg, why do you think you're going to be strong on 2? And I think like every movement is the same when we're trying to learn chin-ups and we're trying to learn all these other things. We need to emphasize breaking that movement down and addressing those weaker components. And that's something that, like you mentioned just before, is that if we're going to do press-ups where the knees are on the floor, that allows us to at least continually develop the chest musculature, if you will, and also build up strength endurance through the chest, as well as encouraging range of motion. But we still need to work on those weaker links.
Yeah.
Now, hollow holds, front planks, side planks, whatever that may be, we need to address. But now we can actually start to separate the program out so they're still progressing and developing the actual movement that we need, and then now they're learning to break everything apart. Then when we bring it back together, now we go from knees, so for example push-ups on the knees, if we go push-ups elevated, so torso elevated, they're learning and they have that association to actually bring the glutes on and squeeze the glutes, engage the quads while doing the same movement they've already been doing for hundreds of reps previously. So for me, that's where I'm thinking, okay, if I'm going to elevate, I need to elevate to a certain level to be just above technical breakdown.
That's it. I think something you just said too is a conversation we had before we decided to do this segment, is that people don't realize how technical and advanced a push-up is, and there's a lot more involved than people think. So what you just said about the glutes, we find that's a big factor as well. If they can't keep the glutes engaged, then they can't keep that hip stability alongside with the external obliques. Once that gets disassociated with, well, now we've got the worm push-up. So if we start thinking about, if I want to improve my push-up, which people should be wanting to do at some point, especially if you're just starting out as gym pop, that's a perfect gym pop exercise. Most of them can't do it properly. Even advanced guys can't even do it. I know guys who can bench 200 kilos that can't do a proper strict tempo push-up. So we break those pieces down. We're thinking glutes are important to work on. We're thinking external obliques and the lower rectus abdominis is important to work on. What else are we thinking about?
I think it's
bracing.
But if we take and then we go to another level above that as well, from a nervous system perspective, it's been able to switch all of that on together.
Yeah.
And one thing that I find is that when we're actually teaching, whether it's push-up, whatever movement it may be, you're first going to get weaker before you get stronger just by learning to engage everything. So for example, if you're doing a push-up, maybe it's a push-up plank. That may be all you need to first off learn. Have your glutes on, have your quads on, have your abs on, have everything in a brace position and be fully protracted at the top. Teach your body this is the end position that I'm going to be in. Then we work on a slow controlled eccentric. They may not push up from that position. They may then go back onto their knees, press themselves back up and control. Because the hardest thing for a lot of people is the moment and you know this now training people in the gym as well, if we over cue someone and they're doing a push-up and you say, okay, squeeze your glutes, they focus on squeezing the glutes and they disengage.
And they lose something else. Yeah.
So we need to teach them without too many movements. What's that plank position? Squeeze everything, hold that. Now I just want you to hold that same thing and slowly guide yourself down to the floor, or whatever it may be, on the bar, however. Then we can start incorporating more dynamic movement once they're able to actually automatically keep all of those in and locked in position. In that position.
Yeah, and I find, like, you know, our philosophy is you work your reps until you have technical failure. When one rep doesn't feel like the other reps, then we stop. The problem is, for a lot of people, their technical proficiency at doing a simple push-up isn't there, so they can't even achieve 1 rep. So if we look at using something like a plank, what I find is that people can barely hold a plank for 10 seconds if they're doing it correctly. So we think about regressions from that, using something like an elevated bar to even get on a plank position there, just like you would with an elevated push-up, and slowly lower them down to the ground and just working them through the capacity that they can personally do until they're ready to move to the ground. Split shot.
Yeah, go. Well, we'll start here because we're going to be regressing down, right? But I think this is going to be, sorry, I'm in the way. This is going to be ideal because in your normal gym pop client, obviously they're not going to probably be as developed, especially in the upper back as Luke is. But what you're going to be able to see here, can you fully retract for me? So as you can see here, we've got shoulder blades coming all the way in towards the spine. So this is going to be complete retraction. Then when we're thinking about full protraction, go into full protraction. Now you can see, especially side on, you're going to see a slight curve in the spine, right? This is not a bad thing. We're focusing on fully pushing the shoulder blades all the way forward, which is going to be the most stable position for the shoulder blades, but this is also the position that we're not really training. For example, if we're doing a bench press, when Luke's lying on a bench, if he's doing barbell bench press, dumbbell bench press, whatever that may be, he's not fully protracting to the point where his shoulders are now starting to actually come away from the bench. He's trying to keep stability. So in this position, we're now training a full range of motion. Do a couple of reps for me of just a regular push-up. And just pause at the bottom. So here, exactly as we talked about, we've got full retraction. But also let's take note of where his hands are relative to his shoulders. So his hands are currently located, so we think about the thumbs are located directly under the armpit. Then when he pushes all the way back up into a full protraction, that's going to be his end range. So now, if this is going to be nice and easy, let's lock this down a couple of notches so that it's a little bit more challenging. This is going to be adding more load, obviously, because we're now starting to get further towards the floor. But as you can see is that the actual the movement of the scapula doesn't change at all. So now when Luke does his reps, hand positioning is exactly the same. There's no breaking through the hips. Come all the way back up to the top for me. And what we'll commonly see is what we spoke about before. This time I want you to disengage your hips, relax your abs, and just let all of this sag as you press. Now press back up. So all here you can see, even in a full protracted position, he can't complete full protraction properly because he's not able to actually engage his hips and keep everything stable. So what he's doing is he's now collapsing here, which is going to throw a lot of tension into his lower back. And then he's disengaging his abs, so he's starting to actually lengthen out his abs. So we want to think, first off, he's going to tuck his bum, so squeeze his bum, keep his abs braced, similar to a plank position. You can see here now he's also going to have to naturally engage his quads. Now when he goes into the full position, we're able to emphasize the chest movement. This is also going to be very useful for teaching people, once you've mastered that plank position, we can progress on to things like pseudo planche push-ups, which are going to be more challenging because we're starting to change the actual lever, which we'll talk about in just a sec. But then when we actually move him now closer and closer to the floor, we're thinking about how challenging is that movement from where he is at the moment. So he's able to, he's obviously carrying significant upper body load. Not everyone's going to be like that, but the stronger or the more upper body dominant your client is in terms of if they're carrying more upper body weight, these movements are going to need to be regressed to where he can start mastering reps. So first off, focus for reps, not for trying to add weight. Once he can nail at least 10 to 15 reps, consistent tempo, not racing through it, full movement of the shoulder, then we can take him a little bit lower. And every time we go a little bit lower to the floor, we're adding more demand. So even though it may only be a couple of inches, that's going to significantly change the amount of load that he's actually having to carry.
Every inch matters. That's what I've been told.
That's life rule.
Unfortunately for me, but I have a good personality, so it's okay. So once we get someone to the floor, okay, now we can load that through bands if we want to load the end range. So bands will alter the strength curve by making it harder as you press. We could also use a weighted vest if we want to keep the weight stable through the entire strength curve. We could use chains, or we could use plates on someone's back, things like that. But we can only load that as long as they can keep what? Hip stability. So if we start loading things and they start sagging again, we have to regress that back. Then we can also change things by elevating the feet. So depending on what we're trying to hit, if I want to make the movement harder and start moving up towards the top of the chest, I can start to elevate the feet a little bit, and that will cause a difference in the mechanics, which then changes where the loading occurs. Well, like you said, with a pseudo planche plank, we might be altering the mechanics by leaning forward as much as we can and bringing the hands toward the hips.
One thing to note as well, if you have a client who, let's say Luke's currently sitting at number 6 on the Smith machine. We move him down to a number 5 or a number 4, and we notice technique starts to break down, so he can only get a couple of reps down here. If we're going to, same way in terms of any type of exercise, if we're trying to emphasize any type of mechanical advantage, mechanical disadvantage. Mechanically here, let's say Luke gets 5 reps, but he just can't get any more, just technique starts to break down. We can then just quite simply, like he's spoken about before using the Smith machine, he can stand up from this position, we can raise the Smith machine up a couple of notches, then he can carry on training the muscles that we actually want to emphasize. Now, he also just mentioned bands. Bands don't have to come in just at the floor. If he can master his reps here, and then let's say he goes to the floor but something just doesn't quite feel right, we can come back up to the bar, put a band around the arms, especially if we're looping it under the hands, and now he can overload this movement and make it more challenging while still taking use of being at a slight incline. So we're able to very much infinitely progress the challenge, even though he's still on an incline, without needing to necessarily overload other parts of the body.
And we could also add those bands if we wanted to change the angle and line of pull to hit certain areas of the chest. So if I wanted to hit more of the bottom fibers of my chest, I could use a torso elevated with bands, which would push the angle this direction. Okay, for a lot of people, like, we don't have a decline bench here, and one of the key exercises that I like to use to get people to be able to do body weight dips and then load the dips is a decline press. If you don't have a decline press, you can simulate that on a Smith machine or with a bar in a rack by utilizing bands and getting stronger in that position, and eventually move them into eccentric dips, and then eventually dips, and then starting to load the dips.
And something to think about as well, we talk about dips have a lot of scapular movement. But if you're going back onto a bench, if you're always pairing some form of scapular stabilizing movement, so any type of bench press, any type of dumbbell bench press, anything where, even a floor press, where the scapula is fixed against an immobile object, you cannot anymore get a full range. We could be pairing, for example, some type of fixed range of movement, so for example, a dumbbell press if you're doing a heavy loaded movement, with something that's going to be more post-fatiguing, such as press-ups. Because that way now we're going from something where you're not fatiguing all of the rest of the body while you're in a position of stability, then we put them into a position of instability. Now we can overload that, but we're also training joints in a more healthy and long-term, probably a healthy range essentially, because you're just trying to think about joint integrity for long-term. The biggest thing that's going to hold you back from being able to progress your bench press is that if you get to a point where joints are unhappy, you can't just keep loading that bench press. You need to come back and address joint health and also strength through an entire range of motion.
The majority of the issues that I see on my table with people with joint disintegrity and pain is the fact that they're not moving the joints in the full range of motion that the human body was designed to do. They're doing partial reps, or they're doing things where their scapula is too stable or too stapled to their rib cage. So we can even take it once we get to the floor, and once we start working on dips, then we can also do things like suspension trainer or rings, and we can start doing those full range of motion stretch push-ups like you were talking about. And now we've taken them from a very stable, pretty much full range to an extended range, unstable position, which will help with a lot of joint stability and integrity.
There's a lot to be said for how you utilize push-ups. So thinking about where you drop them into your program. As I said, you could use them in a post-fatigue way. You could use them in a warm-up way to make sure you're taking your scapula through a full range of motion before you start your bench press. But we're thinking here about the application of what's to then lead after that, or the application of what has led before. And we also need to think about what are the goals of the clients. If we're training our clients to just constantly be bigger, stronger, and be able to move better in certain movements, is that what they came to you for? Because I know a lot of the clients I work with, coaches as well as just general population, they may have kids, they may have a family, they just want to be able to move and play with their kids, they want to be able to live a long, healthy life. Getting them outrageously strong on a bench press, while yes, that might be cool for the gram and being able to say, well, look at what my client can lift, is that what the client needed? Because this is where we start to think about, now we're starting to integrate things like push-ups on the floor, purely from a health perspective, so that they're able to get down and get back up from playing with kids, or whatever that may be. Then also starting to combine in other things like animal flow. We've had a lot of success with animal flow, purely because our clients like to now find that new way of moving, and they've found new ways of actually enjoying exercise. And again, it's bringing that, I don't want to say that exercise or training should always be fun, but you've got to consider who you are training and what their goal is. Because if they just want to look better naked and they just want to move better and feel better, they probably want an element of fun in their training as well. They don't always just want to be fixed in certain ways of moving and coming to the gym knowing I'm just chasing a PR or a PB.
I think too, like that's speaking, from a general population, beginner to intermediate standpoint for program design. But if I'm talking about an advanced client that maybe I do have a power lifter that's bench pressing 200 kilos, like they have to be highly specific and they still have to bench press, but we would utilize some form of press up, whether extended range or just full scapular movement, as a supplementary exercise. So if we think about your A set could be focused on the bench, Your B set might be an accessory movement for the bench, like maybe a JM press or some type of triceps extension or shoulder press or something like that. Then your C sets, or even as a cool down mobility exercise at the end of the workout for a C or D set, you could put your push-ups in there just to make sure that you've hit your heavy work, but now we hit our full range motion work, and keep the scapula rotating and grinding across the rib cage so that you don't develop adhesions that then someone, or dysfunction that then someone has to go and treat and work out for you. And I think it would save a lot of people, especially the advanced guys, especially the older guys, it will save you a lot of grief if you stop demonizing the push-up and start and other exercises that you might deem to be a sissy exercise, but are very important for the way the body is designed to move.
And if we, just before we do wrap up, I think as well, if we think about from a plyometric standpoint, you think about something like a box jump. If a client has to do heavy squats and then they're going into some form of contrast training where maybe they're doing box jumps, if they can't do box jumps, putting box jumps after a heavy squat is probably not ideal. They need to learn that movement first. The same goes for a push-up. If you've just done a heavy bench press and now you're going into some form of plyometric push-up, the client still needs to be able to do a push-up. Beginner, advanced, doesn't matter. They need to be able to move effectively in order to be able to generate the adaptation that you're trying to chase.
So above and beyond thinking about just strength and power and all that, we need to respect what the human body is designed to do and make sure we're moving it through those ranges of motion, regardless if you're a beginner or if you're a super advanced. Push-ups, push-ups.